In the first video, we briefly explained the nature and purpose of the alchemical process. Let us now turn our attention to the classical phases of alchemical transformation, which, not surprisingly, are most recognized as being 7 and bear Latin names. The first phase is called Calcinatio, calcification or dry heating, sometimes also called baptism by fire. As for the veiled laboratory nature of the process, it is described as a controlled incineration of matter with a permanent fire. However, this cauterization does not stop after the material has been reduced to common grey-black ash, but continues until this ash has turned into a handful of fine white powder. From a psychological point of view, what is described here is the first stage of purification of a human being, where the ego allows its inflaming egocentric will to undergo the trial by fire, so that what develops is a personality that is ready to serve the quiet spiritual principle within. This initial phase of liberation from our leaden egocentrism becomes possible with the opening to the spiritual understanding that the sacrifice of the ego-dominated will is the essential key to the liberation of consciousness, and that is how the process of its transformation begins. When the ego understands through its mental abilities something of this process, it tries to imitate it, to replace its harsh will with more cultivated ideas for serving others, but only in order to maintain the image of itself in a more favorable light. That is precisely why, in the description of calcification, it is explicitly emphasized that the cauterization does not stop after the incineration, but only after the scorching of the ashes, when only a handful of white powder remains. Paracelsus pays special attention to the fact that without the complete realization of this first phase of alchemical transformation, the rest cannot be undergone. The second phase is Sublimatio, or sublimation, sometimes also called baptism by air. Here, in the appropriate laboratory vessel, i.e., the soul, by doing something like reverse precipitation, the fine material is separated from the coarse matter. That is why alchemists often called this phase separation, or separatio. From the ashes of the will that has been sacrificed, the purified element of the mother of matter, rises the pure, virginal soul, which is the material for the actualization of the soul-spirit man. During this phase, all feelings, thoughts, and impulses of human action are being guided by inner soul vibrations, which, through the criteria of sublimation, are recognized and distinguished from everything else and can accordingly form a clear image. The third phase is Solutio, or dissolution, sometimes also called baptism by water. It is described as a very slow and perfectly silent dissolution of the solid matter in the laboratory vessel. In some alchemical works, this process is called the drowning of the old king, meaning the egocentric self. It is logical that the change in physical qualities also represents a corresponding physical process. During the dissolution, the various material particles lose their own boundaries and become a homogeneous liquid. In mystical language, that would mean the natural release of the individual soul in its flowing into the ocean of the world soul. The fourth phase is Putrefactio, or decomposition. For this phase, sometimes compared to fermentation, a very mild fire is used, which decomposes each component of the mixture to the ultimate level. That is how we reach the state of first matter, the beginning of the process of creation. And because now it has been animated by the world soul, a new form of life is created that has a much higher and finer organization than the forms and biological life known to us. Alchemical language sometimes uses the word mortificatio or mortification. Traditionally, this phase lasts 40 days and is performed under recovering, meaning without interference or monitoring of the process. This mortification, called endura by the Bogomols and Cathars, is an act of an ultimate and final farewell to the world of the old, in which all the remnants of the skillful imitations of the ego have already been totally unmasked and renounced. The fifth phase is distillatio, or distillation. In alchemy, this phase is often described as creating volatility of the material. The essential and intangible rises up in a new gaseous state, in a new level of matter. It is said that in order to pour the distillate back into the vessel, the steam is fixed by cooling down. This way, although it returns again in a liquid form, it brings with it what has been received from above. The process enriches the substance with new information received from what is called spirit. The microstructure of the elements is loosened, and thus a possibility is created for a subsequent gradual perfection, for a transmutation. The process is described as conducted in a closed system and is often ritualized by a repetition of 33 times. Psychologically, this phase shows the growth within a human being of what has so far only been abstractly called essence. We are talking about a new consciousness here, which naturally turns what has been received from above into action. Distillation is an extremely important phase of the unfolding of the spiritual path. For the alchemist, it holds a risk that he may experience a splitting of his personality, in the sense that he might attempt to spiritually uplift a part of himself without having the necessary foundation for it. Thus, enchanted by his new intuition and inspiration, he becomes addicted to this volatility and forgets about the grounding in himself. And so, he does not integrate everything within himself during the process of self-knowledge and ignores what is too heavy, meaning he evaporates without fixating. The full accomplishment of this distillation requires inner maturity, a complete realization of the previous 4 phases. The result of this is a clear presence of mind, applied to a new way of living. It is believed that the Bogomols and Cathars had mastered this process, so in France they were called parfaits, meaning complete and perfect. The 6th phase is called Coagulatio, or coagulation, condensation. This is the process of new creation. It is described as a condensation, the opposite of distillation, during which the return of the volatile substance to a material state leads to a reconfiguration of matter into a completely new form. From the point of view of spiritual work, this is telling us that the spiritual idea begins to constantly flow into a purified and renewed material form. A new creature is born, an image of the original divine archetype, which makes it ancient, even timeless. As it is described by some, the new consciousness creates its own new body of light. The material for it was called by the alchemists heavenly dew, or pure eternal ethers. The seventh phase is called Coniunctio, or conjunction, called by a few baptism by spirit. This connection is the result of all previous dynamic transformation phases. Both in alchemical laboratories and in our internal processes, a distinction should be made between the so-called small and big conjunction. The small one leads us to the connection between the polar forces, the opposites, the mercury and the sulfur in alchemical terminology. On a spiritual level, these opposites, which create the movement of the external forms, are complementary parts. The result of this unity is the so-called Philosopher's Stone, which turns all things to perfection through coloring or turning into gold, initiating the process of transformation in everything it touches. Or, if we use another alchemical term, it is the elixir of life that cures all diseases. However, we would do well to pay attention to the fact that despite being frequently used synonymously by alchemists, the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life are two different aspects of this process. We could say the male and the female. The stone is the spiritual seed, and the elixir the spiritual ground for it. In Christianity, the interaction between them is illustrated by the Virgin Mary's, or pure matter, conception by the Holy Spirit. Jesus explains it to Nicodemus as being reborn of water and spirit. In relation to this, many engravings were created in the Middle Ages, depicting a king and a queen's marriage, hence the expression alchemical wedding, as in the title of a remarkable Renaissance work, became popular. The idea of the groom, or Christ, and the maiden, the soul, also occupies a central place in the New Testament. The big conjunction, which is only possible in high alchemy, is the ultimate unification of the soul with the unchanging, eternally creative forces, which is unambiguously reflected in the words of Christ, "I and the Father are one." Linking alchemy with the New Testament may sound surprising to some, but in reality, the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and John's Revelation are very serious alchemical works. They are the most significant texts of the Western world that direct us to the transformation of the soul qualities, or metals. The concrete examples for this are probably countless, but in the light of the 7 phases described above, everybody can now discover them for themselves. For instance, what could coagulation be if not resurrection? What about the 7-fold process explicitly emphasized in the Revelation of John, with the 7 seals and the letters to the 7 churches? The processes are also concisely summarized in the 2nd epistle of Peter, a text that has often been discussed as illustrating a 7-fold path of initiation. Here is a quote from it. "For this reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, and steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love." The following words of Paul in his epistle to the Ephesians could not be more alchemical and describe the conjunction more fully. You who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances. We can also add his well-known expression of death is swallowed up in victory. Also, one of the greatest mystics, Jacob Boehme, declared directly in the 17th century that the Philosopher's Stone is the Spirit of Christ which must penetrate the soul of the individual. The path from Bethlehem to Golgotha is precisely the path of transformation and describes the nigredo, albedo, rubedo process as bridges in the passage of Jesus between the phases of baptism, transfiguration, death on the cross, and resurrection. They are also reflected in the characters of Herod, the power-hungry, including the spiritual ego; John, who lives in the desert, purification, and comes to straighten the paths before the Lord; and Jesus, born by a virgin in the crib of the heart, who alone can be Christ, the Son of God. And so, alchemy is a boundless field, but no information on this or any other spiritual subject can help us in any way if it hasn't been actually carried out in our hearts, heads, and hands. The central Latin expression that sums up alchemy is solve e coagula, translated as dissolve and coagulate. And although no one has so far articulated this, the expression may also translate as solve the problem and create a new ability for discernment. The ability to discern is something that each of us thinks they own, just like King Herod. Let us now ask for a higher discernment ability, and let us cultivate it as much as we can. This video even describes how it's done.